Vimal arrives at an ancestral bungalow in the mist-covered hills of Munnar, where the sudden loss of digital connection forces him to slow down. Surrounded by the scent of cedar and rain, he navigates quiet tensions and discovers the beauty of nature through rare orchids and artistic expression. Listen as Vimal learns to trade the noise of his former life for a deep, restorative stillness. Chapter 1. And if the client wants the revisions by Monday, I'll just have to pull an all-nighter in the... The sentence died in the air, severed not by a lack of words, but by a sudden, jarring silence. Vimal pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen. The signal bars, which had been fluctuating wildly for the last hour, vanished entirely, replaced by the hollow void of no service. He stood on the dusty shoulder of the road, the heat of the bus engine still radiating through the soles of his shoes, while the emerald hills of Munnar rose up around him like a tidal wave of vegetation. The silence was absolute, save for the distant mournful cry of a hillbird. For a moment, Vimal felt a surge of genuine panic. The unfinished sentence, the unfinished deal, hung in his mind like a loose thread. He instinctively tapped the screen, refreshing the connection, his thumb moving with a mechanical desperation. But the hills were greedy, they swallowed the road and the signal in one seamless gulp. He was no longer a senior consultant in a glass tower. He was a man standing in the middle of a verdant wilderness, disconnected from the only world that felt real. He began the walk toward the ancestral bungalow, his leather suitcase dragging against the gravel. As he approached, the house emerged from the mist, a sprawling gray stone relic of a colonial era, clinging to the ridge of the mountain. It looked less like a home and more like a sentinel, watching the valley with blind, shuttered windows. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside was heavy, cool, and thick with a scent that triggered a dormant memory, the deep, pine-rich perfume of century-old cedar mixed with the sharp, sharp tang of incoming rain. It was a smell of permanence and decay. Under his weight, the floorboards groaned, a low, rhythmic creak that sounded like the house was sighing in relief, or perhaps warning him. Vimal stopped in the foyer, the sudden transition from the humid heat of the outdoors to the subterranean chill of the interior making him shiver. He didn't hear a voice, but he felt a presence. Ishwar was there. He didn't emerge from the shadows so much as he became visible within them. He wasn't rushing to greet him. There was no embrace, no exuberant welcome to bridge the gap of years. Instead, Ishwar stood a few paces away, his hands folded loosely in front of him, emitting a slow, melodic hum, a low vibration that seemed to resonate with the very timber of the walls. Ishwar's eyes, clouded but perceptive, drifted over Vimal's tailored suit and the frantic energy radiating from his posture. Without speaking, Ishwar tilted his head and made a slow, deliberate gesture toward a heavy oak drawer in the hallway. The wood was dark, almost black, carved with intricate swirling patterns that looked like frozen smoke. Vimal looked at the drawer, then back at his phone, which he was still clutching like a talisman. His fingers twitched against his thigh, a phantom itch. It was the digital reflex, the compulsive need to check a notification, to scroll through a feed, to ensure that the world was still turning and that he was still a part of its machinery. His heart hammered a rapid, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The silence here has a weight to it, doesn't it? Ishwar finally spoke, his voice like dry parchment rubbing together. It demands a certain surrender. Vimal hesitated. The idea of parting with the device felt like an amputation. I might have urgent emails, Ishwar. The project is at a critical stage. I can't just... The project will exist when you return, Ishwar interrupted softly, though there was a steel edge to the gentleness. But you are not here. Not yet. With a sharp exhale of frustration, Vimal stepped forward and placed the phone in the drawer. The sound of the heavy oak sliding shut was final, like a coffin lid closing. When Ishwar turned the key in the lock with a clinical click, Vimal felt a jarring spike of anxiety. It was a physical void, a sudden lightness in his pocket that felt like a missing limb. He felt exposed, stripped of his armor, left alone with nothing but his own thoughts in the oppressive stillness of the house. He began to wander the long, dim hallway, his footsteps echoing. To his left, a towering grandfather clock stood guard, its pendulum swinging in a slow, hypnotic arc. Tick. Tock. Tock. The sound was monolithic. Vimal found himself stopping, his breath hitching in his chest. He closed his eyes and tried to slow his racing heart, consciously synchronizing his inhalation with the swing of the pendulum. In, out, tick, tock.ec. For the first time in a decade, the noise of the city, The sirens, the overlapping voices, the constant digital chime began to recede, replaced by the oppressive, rhythmic heartbeat of the house. He felt a strange sensation of vertigo, as if the floor were tilting, pulling him deeper into a version of himself he had spent years trying to erase. Throughout this, he was aware of Ishwar. The older man had not moved from the doorway. He was polishing his glasses with a piece of cream-colored linen, his movements slow and methodical. Ishwar didn't prompt him to move. He didn't ask him how the journey was or why he had stayed away so long. He simply watched. The long pauses between Ishwar's movements forced Vimal to stand still. It was an agonizing exercise in patience. Vimal wanted to pace, to fidget, to fill the silence with meaningless chatter, but the weight of Ishwar's gaze acted as an anchor. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his restlessness laid bare. "You've forgotten how to be still, Vimal," Ishwar observed, finally sliding the glasses back onto the bridge of his nose. "You move as if you were being chased by something that doesn't exist." Vimal opened his mouth to argue, to explain the pressures of his career, the necessity of speed in the modern world, but the words felt hollow, sounding like a script he had memorized but no longer believed. As he shifted his weight, his eye caught something on a small mahogany side table nestled between two velvet armchairs. It was a ledger, bound in weathered leather with a frayed ribbon marker. He stepped closer, the scent of cedar intensifying. On the cover, in a precise, ink-stained hand, was his own name, Vimal. A flicker of curiosity overcame his anxiety. He reached out and flipped the cover open. The first page contained a single entry dated years ago detailing a series of observations about his temperament and a set of coordinates he didn't recognize. But as he turned the page, his brow furrowed. The rest of the ledger was blank. Dozens of pages of heavy cream-colored parchment stretched out before him, devoid of a single mark. It was a book designed for a history that hadn't been written yet, or perhaps a record of things that had been intentionally erased. Vimal looked up at Ishwar, the blank pages still open in his hand. The older man was smiling, a thin, enigmatic curve of the lips that stayed cold. "The space is waiting," Ishwar whispered, the sound nearly lost to the first heavy drop of rain that struck the roof with the force of a pebble. "The question is, what are you prepared to fill it with?" Chapter 2. Stop counting the minutes, Vimal. The forest does not keep a watch. Ishwar's voice was a low, melodic hum that seemed to drift through the mist rather than travel through the air. They were deep in the valley now, where the green of the highlands shifted into a bruised, heavy emerald. The loam under their boots was thick and saturated, sucking at their heels with every step. Vimal felt the dampness seep through the canvas of his shoes, a cold, creeping sensation that mirrored the restlessness in his chest. He walked with a clipped, urgent stride, his shoulders tight, his mind still ticking through a mental checklist of emails he couldn't send, and deadlines that were currently dissolving into the fog. He wanted to reach a destination, a peak, a clearing, a point of arrival, but Ishwar simply meandered. The old man didn't walk so much as drift, his path a series of intuitive curves that avoided the direct route and favored the scent of damp fern and decaying bark. "We've been walking for an hour, grandfather," Vimal said, his voice sounding thin and jarring against the oppressive quiet. "Are we looking for something specific, or are we just wandering?" Ishwar didn't answer immediately. He paused to touch the flank of a towering tree, his fingers tracing the ridges of the bark with a slow, reverent precision. "You are treating this like a commute," Ishwar finally observed, his tone devoid of judgment but heavy with a quiet truth. "You are trying to arrive. But in the highlands, the arrival is the least interesting part of the journey. You must learn the patience of roots. A root does not rush toward the water. It feels for it, expanding only when the earth allows." Vimal shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. The habit felt like a ghost of his desk chair, a reflex from a life spent staring at a glowing rectangle. He tried to synchronize his breathing with the rhythm of the forest, but his heart was still drumming a city beat, fast and erratic. He accelerated his pace, stepping over a fallen log with a sudden sharp movement, intent on closing the gap between them. He was halfway through his stride when Ishwar stopped dead. Vimal, caught in the momentum of his own urgency, nearly collided with the older man's narrow back. He stumbled, his boots sliding on a slick patch of moss, and he had to throw his arms out to keep from plunging face first into the mud. He froze, balanced precariously, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He looked up, ready to snap a word of frustration, but the expression on Ishwar's face silenced him. Ishwar wasn't looking at him. He was staring at a jagged outcrop of basalt, draped in a heavy velvet of deep green moss, where the mist clung to the stone like a damp shroud. "Look," Ishwar whispered. Vimal squinted. At first, he saw nothing but the gray-green blur of the valley. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the low light, he spotted it, a single pale orchid. It was a ghostly thing, almost translucent, clinging to the rock with a tenacity that seemed improbable. The bloom was a shade of cream so delicate it looked as if it might dissolve if the mist touched it too harshly. Vimal's first instinct was to reach for his phone, to capture the image, to freeze the moment in a high-resolution frame that he could archive and categorize. His hand twitched toward his pocket, but he remembered the silence of his device, the dead screen that had become a mirror of his own emptiness. "Don't try to capture it," Ishwar said, as if reading the movement of his muscles. "A photograph is a memory of a thing, not the thing itself. Just watch. Look at the dewdrop on the lower petal." Vimal leaned in. He forced himself to stay still, fighting the urge to shift his feet or check the time. He focused on the single sphere of water clinging to the petal's edge. It was a perfect, trembling orb. As he stared, the world around him began to recede. The distant roar of a hidden waterfall became a rhythmic pulse. The scent of wet stone and crushed mint filled his lungs. He noticed that the dewdrop wasn't just clear. It held a miniature, inverted world within it. A tiny, refracted spectrum of light danced inside the water. A sliver of gold from a hidden sun, a smudge of gray from the fog. For the first time since he had stepped off the bus in Munnar, the drumming in Vimal's chest slowed. The silence between him and his grandfather shifted. It was no longer the awkward, heavy silence of two strangers sharing a bloodline. It became a shared space, a vacuum where the noise of the city finally stopped echoing. He felt a strange, floating sensation, as if the gravity of his obligations had loosened its grip. He wasn't a graphic designer, a grandson, or a failure. He was simply a pair of eyes watching a drop of water. "This is the art of observation," Ishwar said, his voice now a soft, resonant vibration. "The world is too loud for most people. They see a forest, but they do not see the forest. To observe is to strip away the general and find the singular. Give me one color, one scent, and one sound. Not a list, Vimal, just the truth of this moment." Vimal closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, focusing on the immediate perimeter of the rock. "Cream," he whispered, thinking of the orchid. "Whetstone." And a drip. Somewhere to the left. A slow, heavy drip of water hitting a leaf. Ishwar nodded, a small ghost of a smile appearing on his lips. He didn't offer praise, which Vimal found he preferred. The validation was in the stillness itself. "Why this one?" Vimal asked, glancing at the fragile flower. "There must be thousands of orchids in this valley. Why lead me all this way for one pale bloom that barely exists?" Ishwar began to turn away, his movements as fluid as the mist. "Some things only bloom for those who stop searching," he replied, his voice trailing off into a riddle. "If you hunt the flower, you will step on it. If you wait for the flower, it finds you." As Ishwar began to lead the way back toward the bungalow, Vimal lingered for a heartbeat longer. He shifted his gaze a few inches to the right, toward a shadow in the rock. There, tucked into a crevice, was a second orchid. It was identical to the first. The same ghostly cream, the same delicate architecture. But as Vimal stepped closer, his brow furrowed. The stem of the second flower hadn't withered or decayed naturally. It had been cut. The end of the stem was a clean, surgical snip, a precise severance that spoke of human intervention. Someone had been here. Someone had taken the twin of the flower, leaving the other behind as a lonely sentinel in the fog. Vimal looked at the clean cut, then back at his grandfather's receding figure. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease. He didn't call out. He simply turned and followed Ishwar, the weight of the blank ledger in his bag suddenly feeling heavier, as if the pages were already beginning to fill with questions he didn't know how to ask. Chapter 3. The archive room smelled of dormant thyme and damp cedar, a scent that Jivika Pillai found fundamentally offensive. It was the smell of neglect. Her heels clicked a sharp, rhythmic staccato against the mahogany floorboards, a sound that sliced through the heavy silence of the bungalow like a scalpel. Upon crossing the threshold, she paused, her hand flying instinctively to the small, leather-bound notebook clipped to her hip. She adjusted it by a fraction of a millimeter, ensuring it sat perfectly perpendicular to her waist, before surveying the wreckage of the room. To Ishwar, this was likely a sanctuary of memory. To Jivika, It was a logistical nightmare. Piles of parchment, yellowed and curling at the edges, leaned precariously against the walls. Folders without tabs spilled their contents across a scarred oak table, and loose sketches of orchid anatomy fluttered in the draft from the open window. There was no system here, no Dewey Decimal, no chronological filing, no logic. It was an organic heap, a botanical landslide of paper. "Efficiency is the only way to preserve history," she murmured, her voice crisp and precise, echoing off the high ceiling. "Otherwise, history is just a pile of old laundry." She began her assault with a rigorous, surgical intensity. Jivika didn't just sort, she conquered. She moved with a focused energy, her fingers flying as she separated the botanical sketches from the correspondence and the weather logs from the personal journals. She created sterile, neat stacks on the table, aligning the edges of the paper with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Each movement was a rejection of the chaos. She imagined the room as a puzzle that had been solved incorrectly for 40 years, and she was the only one with the patience to fit the pieces back into their proper slots. As she reached for a heavy, linen-bound folder tucked beneath a stack of old maps, a shaft of afternoon sunlight pierced through the dust. The air suddenly filled with millions of golden motes, dancing in slow, chaotic spirals. Jivika paused, her breath hitching. For a moment, the dust didn't look like debris. It looked like a living thing, a shimmering curtain that blurred the hard lines of her organized stacks. She felt a strange, momentary vertigo, as if the room were breathing. She shook the feeling off and opened the linen folder. Inside were pressed leaves, preserved with a delicacy that made the veins look like translucent lace. They were not arranged by species or date. They were arranged by shade, from a deep, bruised purple to a pale, ghostly cream. Jivika frowned. This was a sensory arrangement, not a scientific one. It resisted every category she had established in her notebook. She tried to slide the folder into the Flora General stack, but the folder was too thick, too stubborn. It didn't fit the geometry of her system. As she shifted the leaves, a small slip of cream-colored paper fluttered out and landed face up on the table. The ink was faded, a soft sepia that had bled into the grain of the paper. There was a handwritten note from 1954. It contained a single sentence: "The beauty is not in the order, but in the gaps where the wind breathes." Jivika stared at the words. She felt a sudden, irrational surge of friction in her chest. Gaps? The gaps were where things were lost. The gaps were where errors happened. The gaps were the very things she had been hired to eliminate. She gripped the note, her knuckles whitening. She didn't want a philosophy of wind, she wanted a filing system that worked. In a sudden, rigid movement, she tried to force the note into a narrow chronological slot between two heavy ledgers, pushing it down with a sharp, decisive flick of her wrist. There was a dry, sickening snap. Jivika froze. She slowly withdrew the paper. The brittle edge of the note had torn, a jagged rip splitting the word "breathes" in two. The tear was small, but in the silence of the archive it felt like a scream. She studied the rip, and for the first time since arriving at the bungalow, Jivika felt a wave of genuine distress. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a physical manifestation of her own rigidity. She had tried to force the history of this house into a box, and the history had broken under the pressure. Some things are meant to remain uncatalogued, Jivika. She jumped, the note nearly slipping from her fingers. Professor Ishwar stood in the doorway, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to settle the dust motes in the air. He held a tray with 2 steaming cups of cardamom tea, the fragrance cutting through the smell of cedar and old paper. He didn't look at the piles of folders or the sterile stacks, he looked only at her face, his expression one of profound, unhurried serenity. He walked toward her with the slow, fluid gait of a man who had long ago stopped racing against the clock. He placed the tea on the table, carefully avoiding the edges of her sorted piles. He didn't mention the torn paper, though he surely saw it. He simply stood there, the steam from the tea curling around his glasses. "The archive is not a library, my dear," Ishwar said, his tone warm and devoid of judgment. "It is a garden. And in a garden, if you prune everything to a perfect lime, you kill the spirit of the plant. You leave no room for the unexpected." Jivika looked down at the torn note, then at the neat, sterile stacks she had spent the last 3 hours building. They suddenly looked cold. They looked like a graveyard of information. She looked back at Ishwar, whose presence felt like a soft blanket draped over the sharp edges of the room. For the first time, the notebook on her hip felt heavy, not with the weight of knowledge, but with the weight of a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. Slowly, deliberately, Jivika reached out. She took the linen folder of pressed leaves and, instead of placing it in the flora stack, She set it slightly askew on the edge of the table. She left it there, protruding and irregular, a deliberate flaw in her perfect geometry. It was a small act of rebellion against her own nature, and it felt more terrifying than the thought of a messy archive. "I suppose the wind does need space to move," she whispered, her voice losing its crisp edge. Ishwar smiled, a ghost of a thing, and gestured toward the tea. "Drink. The cardamom is fresh from the valley." As they sat in a comfortable humming silence, sipping the spiced tea, Jivika found her gaze drifting toward the bottom shelf of the largest bookcase. The wood there was darker, stained by decades of moisture. While Ishwar was lost in a story about the migration of mountain birds, Jivika leaned down to clear a stray piece of twine from the floor. As her hand brushed the underside of the bottom shelf, she felt a protrusion, a small wooden lip that didn't align with the rest of the cabinetry. She pressed it. With a soft, muffled click, a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a shallow cavity carved directly into the mahogany. Inside lay a heavy brass ring holding a set of 4 ornate iron keys. They were old, pitted with age, and bore no tags. Jivika picked them up, the cold metal biting into her palm. She looked around the room, then at the bungalow's heavy doors, and realized with a jolt of curiosity that these keys didn't fit any lock she had seen in the house. They belonged to something else, something that had been intentionally hidden away from the order of the world. Chapter 4. The graphite snapped with a clinical sound that echoed against the granite boulders. Vimal didn't look up, but he felt Nalan behind him, bringing a scent of damp earth and old tobacco. Vimal was hunched over his sketchbook, his knuckles white, pressing the pencil so hard into the heavy cream paper that the indentations would remain even if erased. He was trying to capture the geometry of the valley, the exact angle of the slope, the precise intersection where the stream sliced through the quartz, but the landscape refused to be pinned down. Every time he locked a line into place, the mist shifted, blurring the horizon and mocking his need for a border. "You are fighting the mountain, Vimal," Nalan whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves. He didn't look at the drawing, he simply stood there, tracing the vein of a waxy leaf. "You are trying to build a fence around a ghost. Why measure a thing that only exists in movement?" Vimal rubbed the back of his neck, the skin tight and itching. "I just want it to look right. If the perspective is off, the whole thing is a lie." He gripped the pencil again, treating the valley like a wireframe in a design program, forgetting that the air tasted of crushed ferns and cold stone, not static crackle and plastic. "Close your eyes," Nalan commanded softly. Vimal hesitated, then let his lids drop. The world vanished, replaced by a violent amplification of the environment. The roar of the stream became a complex layering of sounds, the guttural bass of water hitting a submerged log, the high-pitched chatter of spray, and the rhythmic sigh of the wind in the eucalyptus canopy. "Do not draw the water," Nalan whispered. "Draw the sound. Forget the border. Let your hand follow the current, not the sight of it." Vimal felt a surge of resistance. His mind screamed for a grid, a set of coordinates to anchor him. He tried to categorize the sound into undulating waves, but the more he analyzed it, the more the rhythm escaped him. He was a man of pixels, being asked to translate a vibration into a gesture. "I can't even draw a river without a ruler," he thought, anxiety tightening his chest. "I'm still trying to optimize peace as if it were a software update. Why does the silence feel like a vacuum pulling the air from my lungs?" Suddenly, Nalan's calloused hand closed over Vimal's. The old man guided Vimal's wrist in a long, sweeping motion across the page. It wasn't a line, it was a surge. The pencil moved in a fluid arc that ignored the laws of perspective, mirroring the turbulence of the water. Vimal stopped fighting. He let his arm become an extension of Nalan's will, the graphite sliding across the grain in organic swells. For a moment, the boundary between skin, pencil, and mountain dissolved. "Better," Nalan murmured, releasing him. "The mountain does not care for your vanishing points." "It looks like a smudge," Vimal said, though his voice had lost its edge. He opened his eyes. The page was an abstract mess of gray and charcoal, yet as he stared he could almost hear the water rushing through the lines. "It looks like a breath," a new voice interrupted. Jivika approached from the trail. She wasn't clutching her notebook to her hip with her usual white-knuckled grip, her shoulders had dropped, and a new softness lingered in her gaze. In her hand, she carried a large leather binder smelling of old vellum. "I finished the catalog," she said. She opened the binder to show them. Gone were the sterile grids and alphanumeric indexing. Instead, the pages flowed in a rhythmic sequence. She had grouped the plants by their relationship to the wind and light, a fluid system that mirrored the organic growth of the garden. She had embraced the irregularity, leaving wide margins for handwritten notes and pressed petals that overlapped the text. I realized that forcing the archive into a box was like trying to freeze a river, Jivika explained. I've abandoned the grid. It's inefficient by every standard I was ever taught, but it feels honest. Vimal looked from the catalog to his own sketch, feeling a kinship with the archivist. They were both learning how to be imprecise. The air is turning, a warm voice announced. Waris Fatima appeared from the mist with a heavy wooden tray of steaming tea and mismatched ceramic cups. She moved with a rhythmic cadence, a grounding force against the shifting fog. The mountain is pulling the warmth away. If you stay out here with cold spirits, the chill will settle in your marrow. She poured the tea, the liquid a deep amber that smelled of wild honey, chamomile, and rain on hot slate. As Vimal took the cup, the heat seeped into his frozen fingers. The first sip sent a wave of profound warmth through his chest, a golden drowsiness that unraveled the last remnants of the city's tension. His eyelids grew heavy. The world softened into a blur of deep greens and muted grays. He looked back at his sketch. In the golden light of the fading afternoon, the swirling lines no longer looked like a mistake. They captured the weight of the mist and the slow, inevitable pull of the earth. For the first time since arriving in Munnar, the silence didn't feel like a void, it felt like a conversation. As the group sat in a humming silence, Waris leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the bungalow, specifically toward the heavy wooden drawer in the study where Vimal's phone remained locked away. There is a secret blend I keep for the deepest winters, Waris mentioned softly, her voice barely audible over the stream. A tea that brings eternal stillness, a kind of peace that doesn't allow the world to intrude no matter how loudly it calls. She didn't look at Vimal, but the weight of her words hung in the air, a quiet warning about the fragility of the silence they had worked so hard to find. Chapter 5. The sun dipped low, snagging on the jagged teeth of the western Ghats and spilling a thick, honey-colored haze across the valley. It wasn't just light, it was a substance, a warm syrup that clung to the skin and turned the lingering mist into a suspension of floating gold. Vimal stood perfectly still, his boots sinking slightly into the damp loam, watching the way the air seemed to vibrate. Beside him, Jivika had stopped adjusting the notebook on her hip. She looked almost fragile in the amber glow, her usual precision softened by the heavy, sweet scent of damp earth and something sharper, like crushed cloves. Then it happened. There was no sound, no sudden snap of a stem, but a shift in the very gravity of the clearing. In a slow, hypnotic symphony of motion, the rare orchids began to unfurl. Vimal leaned in, his breath hitching. The pale petals didn't just open, they rolled back with a deliberate, liquid grace, as if they were waking from a century-long sleep. They were the color of moonlight filtered through milk, edges tinged with a ghostly violet. He watched a single petal peel away from the center, revealing a heart of deep, bruised gold. It was a movement so gradual it felt like a secret being told in a whisper, a biological clock ticking toward a moment of absolute perfection. Ishwar didn't move. He had stopped polishing his glasses, the linen cloth hung limp in his hand, forgotten. He wasn't looking at the flowers with the clinical eye of a botanist cataloging a specimen, but with the reverence of a man witnessing a miracle he had long since stopped expecting. He breathed in deeply, his chest expanding slowly, his eyes closed. He looked less like a professor and more like a part of the landscape itself, a weathered stone that had finally found its place in the stream. Vimal looked down at his own hands. They were stained, dark graphite smudges from his sketching pencils worked into the creases of his knuckles, and a crescent of rich black Munnar soil beneath his fingernails. He waited for the phantom itch, the habitual twitch of the thumb and index finger that had governed his life for a decade. He waited for the sudden, urgent need to capture the bloom through a lens, to crop the gold, to filter the haze, to send it into a digital void where it could be validated by 1,000 strangers. But the itch was gone. The void in his pocket, where the phone had lived like a parasitic twin, felt clean. He felt a strange, sudden weight in his chest, not of sadness, but of a profound, irreversible cost. He realized that the man who had stepped off the bus weeks ago, the man who lived by the frantic cadence of notifications and deadlines, was dead. The city, the career, the curated noise of his existence had been stripped away, replaced by this heavy, humming silence. It was a frightening realization, the kind that usually triggered a panic attack, but as he watched the orchids, he felt only a quiet acceptance. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound merging with the rustle of the tea leaves. He was a stranger to his own history, and for the first time, he found the anonymity liberating. "The valley doesn't ask for our permission to be beautiful," Ishwar said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. He didn't open his eyes. It simply unfolds. We are the only ones who insist on timing it. "I spent so long trying to time the archive," Shivika whispered, her voice lacking its usual crisp edge. She reached out as if to touch a petal, then stopped, her hand hovering an inch from the flower. "I wanted a grid. I wanted a sequence. But this doesn't fit into a column." "That is the grace of it," Ishwar replied, finally opening his eyes. They were bright, reflecting the gold of the valley. The things that truly matter are always the ones that refuse to be filed away. Waris Fatima approached them then, moving through the honeyed light with her characteristic rhythmic cadence. She carried a heavy iron tray, the steam from the tea rising in slow, lazy curls that mirrored the spiral of the wind bells chiming softly from the eaves of the distant bungalow. The sound was a thin silver thread sewing the silence together. She began to pour, the liquid, a deep, opaque amber that smelled of wild honey and a hint of something ancient, like dried resins and mountain rain. "The final blend," Waris said, her voice a warm, earthy cadence. "For the closing of the day. It is a tea for those who have seen enough and are ready to let the world fall away." As Vimal took the ceramic cup, the heat seeped into his palms, grounding him. They gathered in a small circle, the four of them anchored by the scent of the blooming orchids and the warmth of the brew. The conversation didn't fade so much as it dissolved. The need to speak, to explain, to categorize the experience vanished. They leaned into one another, not with a conscious effort, but as if pulled by a gentle, invisible tide. The boundaries between them, the age gap between Vimal and Ishwar, the professional friction between Jivika and the professor blurred in the golden light. They were simply four souls inhabiting a moment of absolute stillness. Vimal felt a heavy, blissful drowsiness settling over him, a golden fog that mirrored the one surrounding the valley. His thoughts slowed, losing their jagged edges. He watched a single orchid petal drift downward, landing softly on the surface of his tea, creating a ripple that expanded and then vanished. The world felt small, intimate, and entirely sufficient. There was nothing beyond the valley. There was no city, no digital noise, no one waiting for an email. There was only the scent of honey and the slow, steady breath of the mountain. As the honey-gold light began to deepen into a bruised royal violet, they drifted back toward the bungalow in a state of collective somnambulance. The air had turned cool, the mist returning to wrap around their ankles like a velvet shroud. They entered the house in silence, the interior smelling of old paper, beeswax, and the lingering ghost of cinnamon. In the hallway, the great mahogany grandfather clock, which had governed the house with its relentless rhythmic ticking for 50 years, suddenly shuddered. The heavy brass pendulum swung one last time, a slow, sweeping arc that seemed to drag the very air with it, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the last remnants of time. They didn't notice the clock's death. They moved as one toward the living room, their movements fluid and heavy. As they sank into the oversized linen sofas, the violet light of the evening pressed against the window panes, sealing them inside. Vimal felt his eyelids grow impossibly heavy, his consciousness fraying at the edges. He studied Ishwar, who had already drifted off, his head tilted back, a look of profound contentment etched into his weathered face. Vimal closed his eyes, slipping into a timeless, absolute sleep, unaware that the world outside the valley had ceased to exist, and that the silence he had finally embraced had become a permanent residence.